My name is Kendall Davis. I'm the Director of Advocacy Strategy within the Center for Rare Diseases at ICON. So ICON is a CRO. We'll talk a little bit more about that, what that means later. But I've worked in rare disease and clinical drug development for the better part of my professional career, and I'm very excited to be here with all of you today. Quick disclaimer, again, I do work for a company that conducts clinical trials, and I do work with biotech and pharmaceutical companies. The objective today here is really just to provide some overview information about drug development and clinical trials. The information here was prepared by myself based on experience that I do have and does not necessarily reflect the views of any other party. We're going to walk through an overview of drug development and clinical trials, what it means to take part in a clinical trial, what happens after a clinical trial, to go through some resources, and then hopefully we'll have some time for questions. Standard drug development is, when we're thinking about standard drug development, we usually tend to think about more common therapeutics. And this graphic really kind of represents what a standard drug will go through from kind of concept to drug discovery all the way through to hopefully being approved by regulators. Within the context of rare disease clinical research, it follows a similar cadence, but we will talk about some of the differences and some of the nuances that are very specific to rare disease clinical drug development. But really just wanted to highlight here that drug development as a whole is a very long and intense process. And on average, for every 5,000 to 10,000 promising compounds, only 5 will actually make it to the clinical research stage. So that means it's a very tiny number of compounds that will actually ever enter into a clinical trial. And of the 5 that do make it to clinical trials, usually about 1 is going to be approved. So the margins are very, very small. And unfortunately, in rare disease, we see these even get smaller. Traditionally, drug development tends to take more than 10 years to go from drug discovery through to a marketed product, and usually costs a little bit more than $2 billion. So what is a clinical trial? A clinical trial, according to the FDA's website, which you can find down at the bottom there, is a research study in which people volunteer to help find answers to specific health questions. And when clinical trials are conducted carefully, they are the fastest way to determine if a therapy or treatment is going to improve a health outcome. They're conducted to determine whether or not a new drug or device is safe and effective to be used in people, to study different ways in which standard treatments or new treatments might be used more effectively or more easily to decrease certain side effects that we might see from therapies, or to learn how to safely use a drug that exists in a treatment population that it was not previously tested in, for example, children. So within clinical drug development, there are a lot of stakeholders. So before we get into kind of what a clinical trial looks like, I just wanted to outline some of the key stakeholders and how they operate within this context. So you have your life science companies. So these are your biotech, your pharmaceutical companies. They're the entity that's actually developing the investigational therapy or treatments. They're the initiator of the design of the actual trial, which is the protocol. They might gain or get some help on the protocol design, but they're going to be the ones that actually do design the trial, and they fund the clinical trial. The regulators, such as the FDA or the EMA, are the entity that's going to review all preclinical material. So everything that is studied and gathered prior to entering the clinic to determine if a drug is safe and appropriate to use in humans. And they'll also decide if a study can begin. So they're going to look at all of that data and decide, yes, okay, this drug looks good, and yes, okay, you can move it to humans. A CRO, or a contract research organization, is a company like the one that I work for, and so we really work on operationalizing the logistics of a trial. Your specialty physicians, or your KOLs and your clinicians, these are going to be your PIs, or your primary investigators. So they're the independent researchers, and their primary consideration is the safety and well-being of the participants, which are usually their patients. And then we have the participants. So these are the individuals who volunteer to participate participate in clinical trials, and they must be fully informed and consent into participating. Usually clinical trials follow a three-phased approach. So you have your phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, and then hopefully if we get to market authorization, we'll have a phase 4. In a standard structure, a phase 1 trial is meant to evaluate the safety of a drug. So this usually will utilize healthy volunteers to actually look at whether a drug is safe to be used in humans and what it does in the body. So how the body responds to a drug and what potential side effects that the drug might have. If a drug makes it through phase 1 and is seen to be safe, it'll actually enter a phase 2 study. And phase 2 studies are generally meant to evaluate the effectiveness of a drug. So there will be endpoints to determine whether or not the drug actually works, as well as to further evaluate safety. So you're continuing to look at safety throughout phase 2. If a drug makes it through phase 2, we get to phase 3, which are also considered pivotal trials. And this is the phase where we're actually going to confirm the effectiveness. So if we've seen an effect in phase 2, we need to confirm it to make sure that what we actually saw was in fact a positive effect. We continue to monitor side effects, and we may also compare at this point this treatment to others to see how it measures up. And we're also going to be collecting all the information in this phase to take to regulatory review if everything looks good and we want to provide this information to regulators to see if we can get an approved product. If everything looks great and we meet our phase 3 endpoints and we get through regulatory review and we are able to market a product, we will usually see a phase 4 study. And so this is, again, just a study that happens after a drug has been approved and it's available on the market to patients, and it's meant to provide additional information about the drug. So it looks at, continued risk, the continued benefits, the use of the drug, and this will happen for a few years after a drug is on the market. So within the context of rare disease, clinical research is just a lot harder. It's a lot harder for a few different reasons, but the main ones are, we're talking about fewer patients. So where in standard clinical drug development, you might have hundreds or thousands of people that participate in different phases. In rare, we don't have that, right? So we're looking at much smaller populations, and usually these people don't all live next door to each other. So finding places where we can have a clinical trial site can be more challenging because patients are dispersed. And so really identifying how we're going to design a trial based on where people are located, as well as the number of individuals that actually have a rare disease, can be very, very challenging. Also, participation in a clinical trial can be very burdensome. And, this might not, burden looks very different to everybody, but when you're participating in a clinical trial, and we'll talk more about this here in a few minutes, but you're introducing a lot of variability into your daily life. So there's going to be a pretty specific standard of, visits and things that you have to do when you're participating. And so we are asking individuals to introduce burden into their daily life. And when we're talking about rare disease, sometimes this burden is just amplified based on just kind of everything else happening in the daily lives of individuals that have rare diseases, or with a family member with a rare disease. So this is just something that as an industry, we have to be much more considerate about. Many rare diseases impact kids, and it makes designing and conducting clinical research just a lot more intense. So there's a lot of other considerations that come into play when you're looking at doing a clinical trial with children. And so for all these reasons, it's just a lot harder to build and execute clinical research in rare disease. Luckily, we have some really phenomenal companies that are, doing this in a really great way and really optimizing on engaging with the community to make sure that when we are building a clinical program, that we're doing it in a way that's meaningful and accessible to patients. the fact that most or 95% of rare diseases don't have an adequate therapy can be really challenging, because if you're a company that is coming into a space with nothing else, there's a significant set of considerations that come with that. And being kind of the first company that might be developing a drug or a drug that's targeting something different than a therapy that might exist. And it just takes a long time. So for all of these reasons, when we're looking at drug development and rare disease, the considerations are a little bit different. And because the considerations are a little bit different, we do see that regulators are a little bit more willing to allow for some differences within the way that clinical trials are designed to make them more feasible. So for instance, we know we don't have hundreds and hundreds of patients, so regulators tend to be comfortable with clinical trials that require far fewer patients, as well as possibly even letting those first in human trials, so that phase 1 study that is meant to look at the safety. In some cases, regulators will actually allow that to be the patient population instead of a healthy volunteer population. There may also be an opportunity to combine some phases. So where I showed you, we usually have like a standard phase 1, phase 2, phase 3. In rare disease, there is a lot more of a conversation around combining phases in order to expedite the process, because we just don't have time, to be looking at some of these things the same way we would in a more common indication. Regardless of all of this, any drug that's being developed in rare disease and going through clinical research has to be adequate and well controlled, and it has to provide the same safety and efficacy that any therapeutic would. So we do see those standards being the same. So before we kind of jump a little bit further, I want to go over just some terms. I think I've thrown a bunch of jargon at you already, so I just want to touch base on some of the language that we're going to use. You've probably heard a ton of this before, but just for anybody who might be a little bit newer to drug development or some of these terms, we're going to walk through some of the more frequently used language. So within the context of a clinical trial, you'll hear inclusion and exclusion criteria. So this is the criteria that refers to the requirements for being able to participate. So this could include, age, gender, medical history, a bunch of different variables. And it'll be what either allows or disqualifies somebody from being able to participate. A healthy volunteer is somebody with no significant health problems related to the study. So it'll be somebody that does not have whatever disease or indication is being studied, versus a patient volunteer is somebody who does have the disease that we're looking at and is also volunteering. So again, we tend to see healthy volunteers in early phase 1 studies, and then we move into patient volunteers in phase 2 and beyond. But again, in rare, like I said, that can be a little bit different, but that's when we tend to see healthy volunteers versus patients. Informed consent. So this is the language and the terms of the clinical trial. So whenever you, if you decide that you want to participate in a clinical study, you'll be provided an informed consent form, and it essentially outlines everything you need to know about the trial, everything that you can, that you'll be able to know about what to expect, kind of what they're looking for. It's a summary of all the procedures and everything, the risk and the benefit. It's the full analysis. And this is a document that you actually will sign if you do determine that you want to move forward in participating in the trial. An institutional review board, or an IRB, is an independent ethics committee that exists to look at all of the methods proposed for a clinical trial to determine whether or not they are ethical. A placebo, one of our favorite terms in clinical research, is part of it is a type of treatment that looks exactly like the investigational treatment, but actually has no active ingredient in it. So we'll talk a little bit more about placebo-controlled trials in a little while. But a placebo, like I said, usually you might have heard it called a sugar pill, but it'll look essentially exactly like the treatment, but with no active ingredient in it. The primary investigator, or the PI, so this is that medical professional that we talked about. So this will be the key opinion leader, or the physician who's actually going to be overseeing the clinical trial. And they usually will have a site coordinator, potentially multiple, and this is an individual that's responsible for the actual conduct of a trial at a site. Randomization is when 2 or more treatments are assigned to a volunteer by chance rather than choice, and this is used to compare treatments, and it's also a way to reduce any potential bias. I'm sorry, I could not think of the word bias for a second. To reduce any potential bias in the study. Similarly, a single blinded versus double blinded study. So blinding within a study is just another way, again, to reduce bias. So single blinded means that participants in the trial won't know whether they're getting a study drug or a placebo, but the PI would know. If you have a double blinded study, then no one knows. So the participants don't know which one they're getting, and neither does the PI or the sponsor or anybody else. Lastly, so a clinical endpoint. So this is what we're looking at, right? So when we have a clinical trial, what we're looking at our endpoints. So we're hoping that we meet these, and these are generally the most reliable way to measure a response. So if this will be what we're measuring to determine whether or not our treatment is actually effective. A surrogate endpoint is often a biomarker that can be used instead of a clinical endpoint in some clinical trials. All right, so let's jump in and talk a little bit more about clinical trial designs and the controls that are used in them. All right, so all aspects of a clinical trial, the design, every procedure, the way that they're going to happen, all of that is planned for way ahead of time, and it's all put into a document called a study protocol. It is a pretty thorough document that essentially goes through the rationale for the study, what is going to happen, the inclusion criteria, the schedules of assessments. Anything about the trial goes into the study protocol. Usually life science companies, so those biotech and pharmaceutical groups, are going to develop these with regulators as well as specialty physicians. And we're seeing more and more that they're involving patient communities and protocol design, which is fantastic. Usually when we do bring in patient or patient advocacy organization representatives into protocol design, we tend to see a more meaningful and accessible design results, which is always ideal. Again, this will include your inclusion exclusion criteria, how exactly the study is going to be conducted, as well as the controls that are in place to eliminate bias. So again, if a protocol is going to require double blinding or potentially randomization, it'll include all of that information. All of the study sites will get the same protocol and have to do the trial the exact same way. So to really understand if an investigational treatment is working, it has to be compared to something. So depending on the type of treatment, different things will be appropriate. So you might be comparing a treatment to an existing treatment. You might be comparing a treatment to no treatment at all. So this might be where you use a placebo, so you're looking at 2 groups and you can compare the treatment group directly to the non-treatment or placebo control group. Or you potentially could use a synthetic control arm, which might be historical health data. You almost always end up with 2 groups. So you have your treatment group and your control group. And again, these are just used to be able to compare to determine whether or not a drug is actually, or a treatment is actually working. We touched on these a little bit, but again, just to reiterate, to eliminate bias, and this is so important, eliminating bias within a clinical program. The 3 main ways that we do this are through randomization, which is, again, randomly assigning people to either a control or a treatment group, using blinding or a placebo. So let's talk about placebo-controlled studies a little bit. So they're pretty controversial in clinical trials in general, but very specifically in rare disease. And a lot of that has to do with going back to the reasons that doing rare disease clinical trials is a little more difficult because there aren't other options for treatment. A lot of times this might be a first therapy available. The number of people that we can actually look at is very, very limited. And so having, a control, like a placebo control group, can be challenging. When you're talking about children, this is compounded. So if you ever see a placebo-controlled trial, just know that it was very, very highly considered. And if a company determines that a placebo control is going to be the best path forward, just know that there was most likely a significant amount of consideration put into that, because ultimately a placebo-controlled trial is the fastest way to determine whether a drug is effective, whether we are actually seeing some type of effect. And it is the fastest way to regulatory review. So when we have PIs, so our primary investigators, usually they are going to be at some type of medical center, and these are what we call our study sites. And so selecting study sites is a beautiful but very incredible process in and of itself. There's a lot of things that are taken into consideration when we're looking at study sites. And depending on the type of trial that you're trying to run, sites either can or cannot accommodate. For example, if you have the need for MRI within a study design, the site has to have MRI available, or they don't qualify to actually be a site for a study. So when we're looking at study sites for clinical research, we have to look at the staff qualifications. So do we have adequate staff, to actually conduct the study? Does the facility have the equipment that we need? I mean, if you need to store a drug at a certain temperature, does the facility have the appropriate storage facilities for that kind of thing? What's the population profile? So does this individual, the PI, physician, have patients in this indication that they see on a regular basis that may be interested in participating? What does that look like? Where's a study geographically located? Because if we know that there's potentially patients within a certain radius of a site, it may be more appropriate to select that site because patients potentially will be more inclined to travel. Past performance. So a lot of times when we do conduct clinical trials, we are working with sites that have experience in clinical trials. And so we kind of want to know how that has gone for them, how they've been able to recruit, what that has looked like, and what that experience has been for them, and also competition. So we have to look at what other clinical trials a site might be running to ensure that, the site's not running two that are directly competing with each other. So when we're talking about participation in clinical trials, the inclusion-exclusion criteria can get a little bit controversial as well. It can be very stressful to see inclusion or exclusion criteria that doesn't work, or that you don't fit into for a trial. And this can be something that can be very, very stressful to communities. But the criteria is tailored to allow the assessment of the effectiveness of a treatment. So again, this is one of those things in rare disease that we spend a lot of time on, really making sure that we are being as inclusive as possible, while also making sure that the population that we are ultimately going to be studying is one where we expect to see a treatment benefit. Right? So taking part in clinical trials, can't emphasize this enough. Participating in clinical research is deeply, deeply personal. It has to be something that an individual, themselves decides to do, or if you're, deciding for a child or helping a loved one, this is just a very, very personal decision. Taking part in a clinical trial requires significant participation of family. There's a lot of support that is going to be necessary. They can last years. It can be a very burdensome experience. And so it's one of those things where there's a lot of reasons to participate in research, but people really do have to determine for themselves whether or not it makes sense. even though it's not easy, a lot of people do decide that it's worth it and that they want to do it, and some don't. And both of these things are right. The right answer for individuals has to be what feels best for you. If you think a trial is something that you want to participate in and you're ready to take on that responsibility, that's amazing. If it's not for you, it's not for you. And it's, again, just a very personal and very individual decision. If you do decide that you are interested in participating in clinical trials, the journey through the process tends to happen in 3 phases. Or I guess stages. So when you're considering participating, so this is to decide whether or not it feels right to participate in a clinical trial. This is when you're going to be looking at all the information about a study. You're going to be exploring what you think it might be like to participate, considering what the impact is going to look like on your life. So again, if a trial is one where you're going to be traveling every 2 weeks or something like that, like, does that fit into your lifestyle? And does it make sense to try to participate in that kind of trial? We encourage, people to really talk to your healthcare team at this point, to your family, your support network, anybody that could help you kind of determine whether or not this is going to be a good option for you. Have those conversations. You can take your time in deciding whether or not you want to participate. And we encourage, have as many conversations as you need to feel comfortable making that decision. If you decide that it is right for you, then you'll go through the screening process. So this is the process to assess whether or not you're eligible to participate in the trial. So this is when you would get connected to the study site. You'd talk to that research coordinator. You'd ask all your questions. You'd be provided all of the necessary documentation. You would go through a series of tests or whatever medical tests or procedures are required to determine eligibility. And then you would learn whether or not you are in fact eligible to participate. So let's say we get through screening and everything looks good and you're still wanting to participate, then you would actually begin the trial. And this is, again, when you would get kind of that schedule of visits or assessments and whatever is going to be a part of the clinical trial, you would be attending the visit. So depending on how the schedule is set up, you might be going to the clinic site, let's just say every month to get a series of tests. And so you would be in this, the trial phase. During this entire process, they are monitoring your progress and your health and all of the tests that are being done incredibly closely. And at this point, this is when, you would be having quite a few interactions with the study team and you'd be able to, voice any concerns or issues that you are having. It's vitally important for you to know that you have the right to stop at any point in time. If you decide you want to participate in a clinical trial and then realize that it is not in fact working out or it's not conducive to your lifestyle, you do have the right to stop at any point in time. So the journey of clinical trial participation tends to look like this. Not everything is as linear as we've been, presenting it today, but you tend to go from that consideration phase, do I want to participate, to the informed consent, which is again the document that's going to outline everything that you are consenting to within the clinical trial framework. You do sign that, so that it is an agreement that you are consenting to participate in the trial. You then go through all of the pre-screening and pre-screening tests. If all of that looks good, you enter the treatment phase. Once the treatment phase is over, then you enter the post-treatment testing. So there will be a series of or a period of time after the treatment phase where you are still having tests done just to evaluate progress and prognosis. After that, there usually is a follow-up period as well. So just another bit of time where there's going to be follow-up questions, exams, tests, all of that, to really just ensure that all of the progress and the evaluation of the treatment is done as thoroughly as possible. These are just some questions to ask if you're thinking about participating. I'm not going to linger here just because I think we're coming up close to time. So I want to make sure if there are some questions that we can get to them, but you'll have access to this slide deck. I'm happy to send it to ULF so that you can take a look at these. But again, when you're thinking about considering participating in a trial, there's going to be a lot of questions that you might want to think about. These are just some general reasons that people do decide to participate, or things to consider. You may have access, if you do participate in a trial, to a new therapy or a leading clinician in your area. Clinical trials need diverse populations of people, so participating, if you participate, you might be able to add to the diversity. You will be provided quite a bit of information, so it may advance your knowledge level. And if that's something you're looking for, participating in a trial may be beneficial. It also lets you take a very active role in your healthcare. So participating in a clinical trial is being a very, very active participant in exactly what's happening. You have quite a bit of access to healthcare professionals, and you're, again, being very much an active participant in that. There's a lot of different ways, like if you don't want to participate in a clinical trial yourself, if it's just not something that you feel is for you, or it doesn't make sense at this time, there are a lot of different ways that the community can support clinical trials and research. I'm not going to go through everything on this slide because it's quite a bit, but just know that, when you're within the kind of that preclinical or early phase design, if you ever see an opportunity to have a conversation or participate in an advisory board with a company, it's a great way to make sure that your insight is understood by a drug developer and taken into consideration when that protocol is being designed. A lot of companies host ad boards or insight-seeking initiatives throughout clinical research to just kind of gauge where the community is, what type of educational resources might be necessary or beneficial. And so there's a lot of different ways that you can engage to support clinical research, even if participation in a trial is not for you. Let's go through some fun myths and truths. Some people, or I have heard, and these are all the myths and the truths that we're going to show you now, actually have come to us throughout our work here. But the one myth is that the informed consent is meant to protect the legal interests of the research team. No, that is not true. It's meant to protect all participants in clinical research. So it's not just meant to protect the interests of the research team, but for everybody. So that includes you as the participant. There's this myth that if you decide that you want to participate and you get to the point where you're looking at the informed consent form, that there is, you better sign it today. You have to sign it when you're looking at it. And that's not true at all. You can consider it. You can come back. You can have more conversations about it. It is not true that you have to sign an informed consent the same day that you see it. Some people think that a doctor might know better whether someone should or should not participate in a clinical trial. I think this is incorrect. I think doctors are absolutely vital in the decision-making process to help you kind of think through what the experience will be like for you and what some of the benefits might be. But it is ultimately, again, a very personal and voluntary decision, and the patient or the parent is going to know best whether or not they should participate. Again, there's a little bit of a misconception around once an informed consent signed, what that means. You have the right to withdraw from a trial at any point in time. So even if you sign an informed consent and you go through a trial for a few months, like if it becomes unavailable, you can withdraw at any point in time. All right. So after a clinical trial concludes, so once all phases of a clinical trial have concluded, this is when regulatory review begins. So a sponsor company, so a biotech or pharmaceutical company, will have a review meeting with the FDA. So this is where they meet together prior to the submission of an NDA, which is a new drug application. So they'll meet. If they decide that, yes, let's move forward, file that NDA, then the NDA is filed. And this is the sponsor formally asking the FDA to approve a drug. The FDA will then put together a review committee and review the new drug application. And if they decide that it should be approved, they will approve it, as well as they'll review all of the drug labeling. And the FDA also does facility inspections. So wherever the drug is being manufactured, they review and do inspections of all the manufacturing facilities. And if you get through this whole process and everything looks good, then you have an approved drug and you can begin ramping up to market. So the maroonish color up here is the regulatory review section. So this is really, again, just meant to highlight some of the different ways that the community as a whole can support during regulatory review. So there may be options to go to regulatory meetings with sponsors, which is a really incredible way for the patient community to be a part of that, hopefully, decision making. There might be opportunities to do public testimony at regulatory meetings, and this is where they might allow for patients to talk about the drug or why it's so important and how they feel about the approval process. So lots of different ways that you can engage as a community member, again, even if you didn't participate in a clinical trial. So beyond drug approval, so once a drug is approved by the FDA, the company can start manufacturing it. This is when you will start to see companies work a little bit more formally with insurers and payers to ensure that patients get access. There are actually a lot of ways that patients and communities can assist here. Happy to have a conversation with anybody that's interested in that at a later point in time. But also this is a point where sponsor companies may develop access programs to ensure that patients do in fact get access to a drug when it becomes available. So what can patients and patient organizations do? This is really when you, again, can work with payers on reimbursement. You can work with companies on developing assistance programs. There's a lot of different ways that you can provide insight and support that can really assist in this aspect. Yeah. So just some additional resources, and I think we'll have like 12 seconds for a potential question. Oops, sorry about that. There is a resource list in this deck that I will send out to everybody, but it's all of the different websites that we use to create this presentation, as well as some really fantastic deeper dives into different aspects of drug development if you're interested. But I will stop here just to allow for if anybody does have a question. I think, well, now I'm 9 seconds over, so not sure if we can take a question, but if anyone has one, I'm happy to answer.
I think we can ask a couple. Kendall, can you hear me in the room?
Yes. Let me turn my volume up just a tiny bit, but I can hear you.
Okay.
Okay.
And a welcome to Kendall Davis from ICON. Thank you. We're sorry that we joined you late on your presentation.
No problem.
Thank you for repeating, but does anyone have a question? One in the chat.
So I saw a question in the chat about, it says, interested to learn more about how to support clinical trials without entering the trial. So tons of awesome resources. I'll actually add a couple to the deck prior, and then I'll send it over to ULF and it can be distributed to anybody that's interested. My email's at the beginning of the presentation. Also happy to have a conversation at any point in time with anybody. But yeah, there's a lot of really great ways that you can support trials, even if you're not going to participate.
I think that's it in the room. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone.